All right, today I want to do something a little bit different and go really in depth into a recent paper because it deals with so much stuff that we've been talking about in our recent episodes. So first, let's talk about the step.
Take it forward for 4. Overhead, right arm.
No, not that step. The Eurasian step. That place where all the people migrated from. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about ancient DNA, and especially what happens when we match a DNA with archaeological evidence. So we're going to do a deep dive into this recent paper published in the journal Nature, and that's regarding a mysterious group of people called the Avars. Does that ring a bell? Well, it might, because we mentioned them very briefly in the recent Archaeology porn episode on the Scythians as one of those people who migrated into Europe from the Eurasian steppe. So before we get into this amazing new research, who were the Avars? Well, there's a lot we don't know about them. Why? Well, if you recall, the Scythians, they lived during antiquity, and they were butting up right against the Greek world. So they had the benefit of having a lot of nerds like Herodotus writing about them. The Avars, on the other hand, they arrived on the scene in the early medieval period. And what do we sometimes call the early medieval period?
This was a dark age, without law and without order. Men lived in fear of one another.
Okay, let's not be melodramatic. It was called the Dark Ages because after the collapse of the Roman Empire, lots of places in Northern and Eastern Europe lost a written tradition. So there's just less that's known about the early medieval period than during Roman or Greek antiquity. So because the Avars themselves didn't write, and other than the Byzantines, their neighbors really didn't either, we just know a bit less about them and their early history than we do the Scythians. But what do we know? Well, it's not certain, but we think they originated all the way in the eastern part of the steppe, so we're talking like East Asia, where they ruled an area called the Rouran Khaganate. However, in the 500s, so the 6th century, the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, so around the present-day region of Xinjiang in China, rebelled successfully, and they drove the Avars out of the region westward. So the Avars hightailed it out of there, made it all the way west to an area just north of the Caucasus Mountains by the 550s. And by the 560s, a group of them made it all the way even further westward to what is present-day Hungary, and these were called the Pannonian Avars, after the Roman province of Pannonia, which is mostly Hungary, Serbia, Slovakia, that area. And there they established the Avar Khaganate, stretching at its peak all the way from Austria in the west to just east of Crimea in Ukraine, all the way in the east. And there's that word again, Khaganate. What does that mean? Well, the Khagan was the ruler, and you probably know that term better as Khan, as in Genghis Khan. So Khaganate means empire, the Khagan is the emperor. Well, they were able to carve out their space in Europe by basically being a major pain in the ass to the chaotic Byzantine Empire to the south, the Slavs to the north and the west, and various other peoples. Now, they were crafty in playing the different sides off against each other at times, but their main source of strength was led by their emperor, their fierce rating.
The emperor is not as forgiving as I am.
Expert horsemen, they dominated because of their cavalry, but according to some talking by the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, they were useless on foot. So let me read a quote from him. In the event of battle, when opposed by an infantry force in close formation, they stay on their horses and do not dismount, for they do not last long fighting on foot. They have been brought up on horseback, and owing to their lack of exercise, they simply cannot walk about on their own 2 feet. And now you can see why I don't generally use historical sources or don't rely on them as the gospel.
Just because it's in print doesn't mean it's the gospel.
Because While there might be some truth to that, it's obviously clearly exaggerated. But again, there may be some truth to the horse thing, because by the late 700s, another big dude came to town, and he was looking for a fight. And that would be Charlemagne, king of the Franks and soon to be Holy Roman Emperor, the very first one. Now, he invaded eastward, along with some of the many people that the Avars had pissed off. They'd made a lot of enemies. And this seemed to come at a really bad time, because it seems like a lot of the Avar horses were sick. So they really couldn't mount an effective defense, because that's how they fought on horseback. By 796, Charlemagne won, and some of the other neighbors who the Avars did not endear themselves to, well, they took the opportunity to invade. The Avars' land were carved up, and they were absorbed into other people. And after maybe 100 years, you really don't see any mention of them anymore in the historical record.
Why are you telling me all this?
It's plot exposition. It has to go somewhere. Anyway.
Okay, so what has the recently published paper told us about the Avars that we don't already know? Well, as you can see, we lack internal sources about the Avars from their own point of view. So we know a lot about their fighting, but not much about what made their society tick, how it worked, how it was structured. So our friends, the researchers, turned to Ancient DNA. And believe me, this was a blockbuster study. Well, they went to 4 separate Avar cemeteries in Hungary, which had already been excavated, and they did genetic testing on the entire population, all the human remains, plus isotopic analysis, which tells more about people's origins, where they were raised, and their diet. And these 4 cemeteries spanned the entire Avar period, so multiple centuries. And they even covered burials both before and after that period, so we could really see the changeover in genomes over time. Now, I don't think you realize how rare this is. I studied early medieval Britain. So far, there's only been 200-something genomes published from the entire period, and when I can find cemeteries with more than a handful of genomes published, I've hit the jackpot. And this sample included genomes of 424 people. So that, in this small area of Hungary, dwarfs all of the genomes from this time in all of England that have been published. So yeah, it's a big deal. And what did they learn? A lot. First, they used a new computational method that identified even distant relatives, which is normally not possible, and they kind of built a huge family tree, or set of family trees. So for example, at the largest site, which comprised like between 250 and 300 burials, they identified 9 sort of family groups or lineages, over 9 different generations, and they mapped them out spatially within the cemetery. They also located everyone chronologically using radiocarbon dating modeling, so they could sort of see how the families developed. And what did they learn about these families? First of all, they kept it all in the family, not really having kids with people outside of their group of descent, so not other sort of ethnicities. So almost everyone buried there was somebody's parent or sibling or cousin, right? And just like today, they were buried as families in the same area, like a family plot. So to be specific, at this big site, out of, I think, 279 burials, only 64 did not have relatives there on site that were identified. And of those 64 people, almost all of them were women. Why? Because this society was 100% patrilineal. You did not have adult daughters buried with their own mothers and fathers. Put another way, the society practiced exogamy. Now, I know that sounds like some kind of alternative lifestyle, but it really just means that women go to live with the family of their husbands. And actually, that was pretty much the standard practice in most of the West until pretty recently. So family relationships were close.
Jamie and I are more than brother and sister. We shared a womb. Came into this world together, we belong together.
Well, no, not that close, because even though they lacked writing, they must have had some system to really follow lineages, because we don't find any examples of even distant consanguinity. And what does that mean? It basically means marrying your cousins. And that's a lot more than I could say for more modern European populations. After all, they didn't call Queen Victoria the mother of Europe for nothing. And there were families, royal families like the Habsburgs, who were notorious for just marrying their cousins. And yeah, that didn't turn out so well, did it? What we did find multiple examples for, however, are levirate unions. This is like when a woman's husband dies, she marries his brother or his uncle, or maybe not marries, but has kids with. Now, before you get all judgy, this also actually happened in lots of times that are more recent and we're more comfortable with. Ever heard of that famous match made in heaven before it went to hell? Catherine of Aragon and King Henry VIII? Well, the only reason those two got married was because Catherine's first husband, Henry's older brother, died prematurely. Now, Catherine claimed she and Arthur had never done the deed, but yeah.
Weird.
Now, in terms of polygamy, the evidence was mixed. They definitely found instances of guys who had children with multiple women. However, in most cases, it seemed like those women, the mothers of his children, died young. This suggests a totally innocent explanation. His wife died young, probably in childbirth, and he remarried. However, there were other cases where men had children by multiple women, and those women survived long for that time into what was considered then old age. And that suggests some pretty interesting family dynamics.
You got me twisted. You're supposed to be my friend, more like a sister, and you're gonna do the one thing I thought you never do. Sleep with my man, let alone my husband.
After all, the highest status burial based on the rich grave goods and sort of the location of the grave. In fact, it suggested that he was one of the frickin' Kagans. Well, he had more relatives around the region than anyone else. So yeah, that too hasn't really changed. Rich dudes like to get around. Okay, so what else? Based on the isotopic data, we can see that these people were the descendants of immigrants. They were not immigrants themselves. They were born and raised locally. And remember, they intermixed very little with other people. And also, one of the miracles of modern genetic studies is it's not just looking at you, it lets us peer into your genetic background. And what we determined on top of that isotopic data was that the intermixing that did occur, it occurred way back in probably the Caucasus, before these folks made it to Europe. So putting that all together, what that means is these people migrated together, and they stayed together even long after they went native, and they didn't receive newcomers from from Central Asia or from the Caucasus during these centuries. And that contradicts what was previously thought. It was previously assumed that these communities were supplemented with successive waves of immigrants. And that makes sense because that's how modern immigration happened. People came to Ellis Island and then their relatives followed them. Well, that didn't happen here. Oh, and those isotopes also told us there was quite a significant change in diet. In the early phases, the people had a very plant-heavy diet which seemed to consist of millet, which would make sense because that's a staple crop in the steppe. However, in the later period, like the 7th century, they shifted the kind of plants they ate, and they moved towards a much more meat-heavy diet. And finally, also in that 7th century, we see a change in the communities too. Certain lineages are no longer present in the cemetery, while other new ones appear. And at the same time, we also see some changes in the society. Basically, the grave goods and some of the treatment of the burials also change. However, remember our discussion with Tom Booth a couple weeks ago? Genetic replacement doesn't necessarily mean what it sounds like, that there was some kind of genocide or one group drove off the other. In fact, there's no evidence of that here because we don't see any evidence for violence on these skeletons, which you'd expect if there were battles. Moreover, that genetic change, remember, it happens at the same time as the change in diet and material culture with the burials. So that all kind of speaks to some more complex and subtle social change. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that now. And so you see the power of ancient DNA. It told us the overarching history of these people, and that was different than what was previously thought. It revealed communities that arrived from the Caucasus and in fact originated even further, probably in East Asia. They came from the Caucasus as whole communities, and they stayed that way intact for hundreds of years. And combined with the isotopic data and the radiocarbon data, we learned a bit about how they changed over time in their lineage and their diet. Meanwhile, the archaeology, the human remains, the grave goods, the cemetery layout and features, that tells us a little bit more about the how and the why that this stuff happens, and it fills in some of the finer details in between the historical narrative. Together, all of this evidence, the molecular evidence plus the archaeological evidence, gives us a good understanding of the history of these communities, as well as a shockingly close view into the lives of individual people. Okay, well, I think I've geeked out enough, but I hope you can see why I find this stuff, ancient DNA, so exciting. So, ancient DNA.
Now, that's a good thing.
Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.